Creek fame. His unique way of thinking about all things green burial is like this magic lamp that I get to polish every once in a while. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today are things that Billy and I have discovered. And today I'm also talking about ways to gather those underpinning facts related to green burial. And my job is then usually Billy takes the front and I get to translate by putting them into a format that people can really understand, I hope. I also want to note that it's no secret that we're losing the media battle around what green burial is and isn't. So we need to find better ways to get our point across. My plan just for the next about 40 minutes or so is to run through some slides comparing both content and design. And they explore various ways to answer some of those burning questions that we all as green burial advocates get asked. But first things first, I'm hoping you'll indulge me in a little nerd out for just a second. I spent a lot of time working the psychology of persuasion in my day job in university development before I came to applying it to funeral reform. So I've always been curious about how people absorb information. And the common assumption about how humans learn best is that we do so through experience, observation, and studying, which I think is just a variation on repetition. So how many times have you heard it said that you need to hear something 7 times or 11 times or whatever to take something in? The problem is that when we're out speaking, we don't have 7 chances. We usually have one. And with just one interview with a reporter, one talk at the local Rotary. But a little bit of digging revealed some interesting things that I think could have a real impact on the work that we do. So this may seem like a really nutty way to start, but the work of Temple Grandin has a lot to teach us. Grandin, if you don't know about her, she's a high-functioning visual autistic. She's known best for developing slaughterhouse cattle chutes to minimize the anxiety. She was able to identify and explain how her own brain worked. And then she was able to research to expose a whole lot more, coming up with this basic theory of these 3 types of thinkers. And we all know people with an innate understanding of abstract concepts and patterns, things in subjects like math and music. And, all those spelling bee wins that came so easily to me in like the 2nd grade, that relied on this ticker tape that runs through my brain while people are talking. So I understand now that I'm a verbal logic thinker, not a brainiac, just one of these guys. Then there's my granddaughter, sorry. She's like Grandin. I've learned since then that my own husband and about 20 other relatives, they all see everything in photographic images. That's how they memorize, that's how they learn, and that's how they process. So when I dug down into research by cognitive psychologists to learn more about how visual thinkers work, I discovered the picture superiority effect. According to this theory, the brain, and that means everybody's brain, stores images as both images and words and phrases, but words only get stored as words, which makes it harder then to locate that in that big filing drawer we call a brain. So here was the big reveal for me. The human brain processes images 60,000 times faster than text. Our brains have a coding system that allows us to understand images with little context and at lightning speed. And here's another fat tidbit. 90% of the information we take in is from seeing it, not hearing it, or reading it. Images elicit emotional responses, making the memory more vivid and more likely to be recalled, if not in detail, at least in feeling, whether you're a visual thinker or not. And not all images are universally understood, but we can find ways to tailor images to create that feeling that we're trying to convey. This is huge for us when we're trying to explain green burial. Last thing, images enhance a perception of truth. And I think we always thought that prior to AI. So, note that I said perception. Now, here's your first test. This slide is essentially the same information on it as the previous one, but it presents it very differently. Which one will you remember better later? The previous slide was a list of facts with memorable images. This one includes the same facts, but uses color and an intriguing image instead of photographs. Both rely on imagery, but there's one more element here that we need to add. What else is different? The difference is that this one deliberately sets out to engage the viewer. Before it was a viewer, now we have someone who's going to be interacting with what we're asking. Part of our job is striking that right balance between conveying the facts and eliciting that emotional response that'll aid the audience in retaining this information and retaining it in a positive light. So that's a lot of what we're going to be sort of threading through here as we go. So I mentioned the audience. Who is our audience? For those of us who are out in the community trying to explain this stuff, it's all these groups and more. Every one of them communicates with their own members in a particular code, usually depending on shared beliefs of some kind. So every time I speak, I tailor how I'm presenting information in ways that I anticipate they generally are likely to communicate with one another. I'm guessing a lot, but better to guess than not care. What I'm really trying to do every time is tap into that language that they're fluent in so that I can get my message across with the least amount of effort. And here's a fun example. I spoke to a permaculture group in 2014 when green burial was a complete and total outlier to their interests and their mission. Now, I could see the connections, but I had to find a way to really show them. And luckily for me, I discovered that permaculturists have a formal set of 12 principles that I could use to draw the audience in, like connecting them to green burial practices. So every one of those 12 slides I built had a different principle that applied to the topic area. And I've been invited back every year since that first talk because they got it. They got that I got them. And here's that list again that we just looked at. Updated a little bit at the bottom there. We've got some recent data on fossil fuel use in conventional cemeteries. Might want to add that. This list, as you can see over time, it gets simplified and simplified more. Has a lot more work to do at this point. This was actually earlier than 25. But I want to stop for a sec and give credit to Mary Woodson, who was the person who came up with these statistics, literally on a napkin. And then she got them published in Outside Magazine in the early 2010s. And I asked her to update them in 2014, and these are the numbers from then. They've been widely referenced, but have failed almost every single time to give her credit. So please, please, please always credit who and where you get your data from. It boosts your credibility as well as giving them the credit that they're due. And by the way, if you're using these stats still, they do need updating. Obviously, we're 11 years out. It's likely that they're proportionately similar, but I encourage you to think of other ways to describe this. Okay, so that gets us to looking at some specific slides. It's kind of like what we were looking at now, but move forward in a minute here. I want to look at the basics of natural burial slide that probably everybody has some version of. This one, I wanted to show you again quickly. This one's another from the permaculture series from way back in the day. I was trying to get all the altruistic reasons for choosing natural burial on one slide. I look back now and I know I probably looked like a kid who badgers their parent to let them stay up that extra half hour, all the reasons they're there. Well, what I've realized over time is that people want to know how at least as often or not more than why. So sneaking in the whys throughout the presentation where you're explaining how is really more effective than this laundry list of you got to do it. Here's another sort of aside around this, just a process thing. I sometimes deliberately overload my slides with bulleted list information. Sometimes I do that, but if I am going to go with that strategy, I'm going to begin the talk by telling people not to worry about the text and not to take notes, that I'll be sending them a PDF or I'll be posting the presentation on my website so they can read and absorb it at their own pace later. And I'm going to tell you the same thing right now, because you're going to have access to everything we have here, including a PDF of this talk, all of the infographics, everything, when we're done here. So you don't have to write anything down except a web address at the very end. But the reason I do this, I want to assure people that I'm going to pick the most impactful information to narrate to them. And that gives them permission to hone in on the images and the graphics, right? And because we know that's the most effective way to engage and to teach. So over the years, I've settled on 2 slides that explain the absolute basics. Any variation of these will work for you, I'm sure. But this first one is a short list with one very powerful image. They'll be looking really closely at this picture. There's a lot to see here. I'm going to do that while I do not read them what's on the slide, because they're adults just like you are, and they really resent being read to. What we know, thanks to this science, is that they're capable of skimming that list and immersing themselves in how the image makes them feel simultaneously. And they can also hear me when I'm describing what's happening in the slide by saying, hey, did you know that of the 17 states that have legal depth requirements, only 2 are deeper than 4 feet? And that's just another foot deeper. 3.5 to 4 feet is where these lovely microbes and beetles do their best work. And without vaults or metal or rainforest wood caskets, there's nothing to impede the natural process. So boom, done. We've covered the basics. And by the way, that last piece that's there, the pricing piece, you can keep this here if you want to and speak to it, or you can remove it. I'll show you all an alternative, but you can see the difference just visually and how much more relaxed you feel when you don't have to read that one more line. So we'll talk about what to do with that later. So this is the second one. I like to trot this one out for certain audiences who likely have more analytical process questions, like medical folks or science brains. And I walk them through the various aspects of the grave itself. And what this does is let me plant seeds. This is going to show them the practical application of the concept of natural burial so they can relax. They're going to know that it must be doable because there are pictures. And with all the practical stuff out of the way, I can then narrate through photographs that I'm going to follow with. I'm going to show you those now. But what I want to do right away when I'm on this slide is give the audience a sense of what it might feel like to be at a green burial service. That's the real hook with this and with the images we're going to. One thing I would caution you about is choosing romantic or really pretty pictures over ones that tell a fuller story. There's a place for them, but we'll see what those are. So I start people with the procession. Usually there is one. If there's not, in the cemetery near them, then we can still talk about this, because part of what we're saying is that the cemetery, the funeral starts at the gate, and it brings people into liminal space. So I'll be speaking to them about things like that and about why it's important for us to be physical, because grief is has physical responses, not just emotional or spiritual. So those are the things you can say behind this kind of a slide. I'll move on to transporting. I want to make sure that everyone knows that we're trying to increase access for everyone, that we're going to have mobility challenged and the deceased, finding ways to get to that grave site. And we might not all do it with that burro that was used. Jody tells me one time at White Eagle, but people love it, and it gets them feeling how it would be. I show them the grave. The grave will already be prepared. Everything's fine. We're going to put biomass in the bottom. I'll explain why we do that. I'll explain why we have wide planks or some kind of a mechanism for people to stand on, and what those rails look like, how this is going to operate sort of in a general terms. I want to let them know that all ceremonies and rituals are going to be possible, including full military honors. That part of our goal is to accommodate everyone. Then I'll show them a little bit more about the lowering. I'm trying to do this in sequence, and I'll show them there are various ways to manage that lowering. It takes a little bit of that fear away. You can mention again, this is only 3.5 to 4 feet. Nobody's back is going to get broken. And then we'll go to the grave closing, and we can start talking about blanketing, and we can point out those really tiny shovels and how children respond to being included, how it's their job to help finish filling the grave. And again, how physical that is, how important it is. And then I'll stop with the finishing. And I want people to see this and recognize that when they walk away and look back, they're going to feel complete. So, all of that sort of paints a picture for people. It's very simplistic. I've just used certain pictures that I think are going to resonate with people. You can switch any of these out, but I do want to go back to what I said about choosing images that further the narrative over showing just the pretty, because these images do both, and they have a stunning impact on audiences. And I love putting this in front of people. But I also show this one to other groups because I want to convey that simple and natural is also the norm. I notice this slightly faster pace of these slides too. And don't worry, if you go a little bit faster, sometimes I just use like one line, but it adds a certain dynamism that really engages if your pace is right, and you'll know what that is. So that's a real a plus, I think, is having something like this in your sort of bag of tricks, right? So a couple more things about visuals. Let's talk about those. Do you remember this greener way to go infographic? This was circa about 2014, 2015, I think. And I still don't know if it's really Nathan Butler or the Star who actually designed this. I'd love it if somebody could tell me. But interestingly, there's a newer version that's surfaced. And this has the GBC logo on it. And it really speaks to the point I'm making about romance and nature. There are several changes in the new one that are just as problematic as some things in the old one. But what stands out the most for me is the reduction of floral display on the conventional grave and the introduction of a pretty elaborate bouquet of hothouse flowers on the green burial side. And flowers, of course, are a choice anyone can make. I'm not trying to be judgy about it, but as advocates for all things natural burial, I think you can see why this image might feel a little bit off to viewers when the person who's presenting it is trying to convince them to go all the way green, especially if you're going to plan to talk about restoration of grave sites with native plantings. So watch for things like that. Just pay attention to the details, because believe me, the audience is taking it in. So I went back and found a few of these too. You can date this original GBC infographic by its size and its color scheme, I think, but it was groundbreaking at the time. Journalists especially appreciated the descriptions of impacts in terms that average people can get their heads around, right? Distances and all that kind of thing. But note that there's nothing here to persuade anyone in any direction other than to try not to die and pollute so badly. A few years after that, the folks at Keeper came up with this one, much more visually appealing and absolutely jammed with facts. The problem was that it was originally designed as that long column on the far left, and people really can't take that in a slide. But this is proof of the basic tenet of persuasion. You can clearly see that there are two opposing forces at work. The first is how things are at the moment and why we need to fix them. The second tiny part is the vision or the replacement. So we need a better balance of explaining what we're advocating against, but also what we're advocating for. So I started to think more about scale. Instead of these complex infographics, why not use smaller on-point infographics that are mixed in with those trimmed down bullet lists and compelling images? I think we can accommodate all kinds of learners and processors this way. So I started out by experimenting with these two pretty simple graphic ideas, sort of mostly to organize my own thinking. But I wanted an image that clearly demonstrated the cyclical relationship between burial, the dead nutrient part, and the cemetery offerings, the above ground life affirming activities part. Even that didn't feel quite on. So I used one of those and then decided to try to make a further connection between actual goals of green burial, things like soil health and water safety. The narrative for this slide goes kind of like this. During our lifetimes, our bodies have taken nutrients from the soil to live and to thrive. In death, we can replenish what we took by becoming part of the soil itself. Burial contributes to major conservation goals by capturing and storing carbon, providing nutrient exchange for diverse microbial soil communities. And green burial is safe for water too. In fact, a family of 4 flushes 100 times more nitrates, the thing we're afraid of, in one day than one body emits over its entire burial. So it's positive, new information, images with, proof of life, and it's easy to see how it all relates. Embalming is another good example of what we have to address kind of on the con side. We have to mention it, but we also have to assume that they know very little about it or why it might be problematic. My main goal here is to answer the top 4 questions about embalming as economically as possible. So I kind of get through that as quickly as I can. But I am sure to include it because it sets the table for another topic that the audience likely didn't think would be related to green burial, and that's worker safety. That's part of our mission at the GBC too. The reason this is useful to include is that it gets the statistics out there right in front of them, while in the background, you're telling them the human story behind them, real safety issues for real people who work in these professions. And the audience then begins to understand that green burial is not just a choice they're making for themselves. And that's a powerful realization. You get to say green burial eliminates all this, so you can turn the negative into a positive. Now, I don't know about you, I'm exhausted by having to explain why cremation processes are not green burial, but because it's such a thing out there, we really have to. And if you've already covered the issues with conventional vault burial, then you need to put an environmental lens on cremation too. And after one particularly widespread and really discouraging article about the wonders of green burial that had nothing to do with green burial, Billy Campbell and I set out to write a white paper, became a blog post that used science to tell the cremation story. We tried to stay as even keeled as we could, but we dug down into the facts. I got, though, that it was too far into the weeds to reach a lot of people. So I took that and translated the gist of our research into a simple to use comparison chart. And as you can see, it still doesn't lend itself well to easy reading in a slide presentation, but it does give us a really solid starting place for explaining each type. And by the way, I've worked this up into a 1-sheet flyer that is included in your resources, and you can just download that, print it off. It's a great handout. People, they don't want to, they can't read this or take it all in, but they'll bring it home. So consider that. So back to using bullet lists in a compelling image. We can describe the facts for all 3 processes I found most quickly and consistently by using this format. Almost everything you need to know about the environmental ramifications of each process and the leftover disposition dilemma is right here on this and 2 more slides. So starting with flame cremation, this is key because it introduces the elemental nature of crushed bone. This probably sounds so boring, but it is the building block for what you're going to need to explain next. And that is why alkaline hydrolysis and human composting are cremation processes. The answer, by the way, is because they have the same goal. They're removing the soft tissue. usually in an industrial setting, but that leaves the bone and the other durables, right? Hair, teeth, nails, all that has to be disposed of if it hasn't been processed. So if you get challenged on this, just tell them to look it up. They'll find alkaline hydrolysis and natural organic reduction under cremation law in every state that is legalized. So starting there is really important. More people are starting to get that flame cremation isn't green, so they're hopping over to alkaline hydrolysis and human composting instead of natural burial. It's hard to be patient with that, but I'm pretty careful to concede that alkaline hydrolysis may be greener than flame cremation or vault burial. Greener, but not green burial. That it still uses fossil fuels and still has to dispose of the bones, plus the effluent that no agency, the USDA, the EPA, or any state organization that I know of, the state agency, they have yet to design any safe disposal protocols for this. And there's little to no burial involved. So, by the way, here's another aside. Please start using trademark designations for companies that are promoting their own branded product lines. It'll really help clear up the distinction between the business and the process. Lots of confusion out there about that. So same here with the branding for human composting. This is a really tough topic to tell environmental truth about because people come to green burial talks now so emotionally convinced due to those waves of marginal reporting that human composting is green burial. I was mentioning to Maura earlier that a conversation that I had with Katrina Spade don't even know how long ago, while ago, was, I was saying, can we do something about messaging around this? And she said, well, she always tells people that human composting is neither cremation nor green burial. It's a third option, but I don't think anyone's getting the message. So the other reason that this is tough is because there are so many variables in facilities and in the practices themselves, including natural resources expenditures. We can't yet quantify those. So I tend to use visuals like this one. This is a picture from soil that's right out of my garden. The second picture down is my kitchen compost. You can see the little eggshell in there. This shows without a doubt that the result of human composting, the one on the bottom, is not soil. And again, not burial, green or otherwise. And we'll talk about that again here in just a minute. If I don't want to dig that deep for a particular audience, if that feels like too many slides with too much deep information, I focus in on the general process and just explain it while they're looking at these images. And I'm able to explain the disposal issues by giving them a front of the house, back of the house view of a couple of, $1 million, multi-million-dollar high-tech facilities. And then I put that right next to a rural plywood cradle system, plus that realistic view of what those truckloads of leftover wood chips really look like. If you need to, just skip the details, just show them the reality. And one recent development that I was just talking about, this might really interest you, very important. I'm doing research for work with some folks from the Veterans Administration. And the VA has issued rules around acceptance of alkaline hydrolysis and human composting remains. They state very clearly in their rules and regs that only amounts commensurate with a flame cremation will be allowed in VA cemeteries. And by the way, they're also really clear that there will be no tree planting over or even close by. And most cemeteries that I know are in agreement with those two basic principles. So here's another way of speaking to the same issue with just a little bit of a twist. Remember, I was talking about the money. If you use the bulleted slides that we looked at earlier, and then you remove the pricing, you could add this slide and you use this instead of the previous one. This is really helpful. This connects the dots between the amount of time each process takes and how much it's going to cost. These are two critical choice factors that many people are going to be using. So put them in a way that they can compare. So compare that visual to this visual. This graphic is dumbed down even further, right? You can get a sense that there's a very different emotional impact of just having the facts here in a comparative way, as opposed to the images. But this is helpful if you're in an audience where you need to reduce the heat and still get your point across. So it's another way to go. All right, but if you're feeling really ambitious and not worried about being run out of town by those disappointed composting enthusiasts, here's a slide I designed for a group of scientists. They specifically wanted to know the backstory on bulking agents, and even more specifically, the alfalfa. This is a tiny bit of the picture, but here it is. There's been a lot of investigative reporting in the last couple of years about water rights in the Colorado River Basin being bought up by Middle Eastern business interests. There was an article on NPR just yesterday about this. In that research that has come out in the last couple of years, it's also been determined that about 86% of all that water drained out of the basin is used to grow livestock feed. And of that, 32% is for cultivating alfalfa and a little bit of corn silage. So that's the green in the composting mix used by some human composting facilities. I'm not saying use this slide by any means. It's way too far in the weeds, but I wanted to show it to you because it creates this multi-layered graphic to give specific viewers a better sense of the scope of that one small aspect that, when we put the picture all together, could have huge implications. I do this a lot with green burial cemeteries. I map them out. And when people see almost 500 cemeteries on one map, they're blown away. So find ways to use images like that. So that's way in the weeds. Going in the opposite direction, we can also get our point across. And when we're trying to make the case for big picture climate resiliency, nothing speaks louder than carbon emissions. So here's a simple graphic that lays out what we know and a little bit about what we don't know. Going through each option for an audience culminates in our being able to declare quite clearly that natural burial is the only method that sequesters carbon. So when we're talking about sequestering, don't forget to add, we're also sequestering nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus. So this is a really good way to get that simplified in front of people. Stepping out to get an even more global view, it's relatively easy to find reliable statistics worldwide, but you have to match apples to apples. So all three of the resources that I'm using here, you can see everything on the bottom tagline. They all cross-reference identical data with each other, and they're each recognized for their own integrity. So that's where I'm going to go to get my facts. It's important for creating these type of graphics because there are a lot of big numbers, really big numbers, and they need to be corroborated, even when they're likely to change tomorrow. Speaking of that, for almost 2 decades, there was this online agreement that cremated remains weighed somewhere between 7 and 10 pounds, right? I think we all sort of have had that in our head for a good 20 years. And recently, someone brought to my attention that Google searches are starting to show that the average is 3 to 7 pounds. So that's when you see some change like that's a monumental change online. Like, you really need to consider the source or the sources. You have to think about what their motivation is for putting new numbers out there. Is it possible that there are new technological advances that are causing this to be true? But until we get to the bottom of those kinds of questions, when you come up against them, just go with your firsthand experience. If it's anything like mine in the last 2 years of handling cremated remains, I can guarantee you nobody's lost any more weight than I have. So back to carbon and the problem with statistics of making them feel real. This is really easy. You can do this for your state. This is my state of New Hampshire. I researched the death rates through vital records, and took the cremation rate at the time of that census. So you want to be sure it's the same year. You can get that from the Cremation Association in North America very easily. I was able to take those two things, calculate accurately how many people were cremated, at least fairly accurately. But from there, I could calculate their carbon emissions. And from that, I could then sort of estimate, even though it's a little unrealistic, but what would happen if those people who were cremated were instead buried naturally? What does that look like? It's fairly impactful, right? And these are more accessible numbers, the more easy to comprehend, I think. But even more importantly, this gives you a chance to lay out the difference between carbon output of cremation versus sequestration through green burial. This opens the door to introduce the term cremation conversion. And the reason that's important is that when people hear that other people have switched teams, they feel like they now have permission to change their minds. And that's what we're trying to do here. While they're feeling receptive, here's the closer. You could remind viewers why they're there to better understand how their choice will reflect their values while impacting their loved ones, their community, and the planet that's nourished them. This is an example of blatant persuasion, even subtle manipulation. It's two sides of the same coin, but it's also a reliever from the heavy statistics that we had to wade through to get here. So kind of an easy on the eyes thing. Okay, enough with the statistics. So here's a major area of green burial theory and practice that gets avoided because it's steeped in ancient practices and religion and, superstition, inaccurate assumptions about the law, all kinds of stuff. But we need to begin making our case through a methodical and logical presentation of the facts in order to bring people to that real kernel of hope that's inherent in natural burial. And that's the promise of sustainability. And here's how I frequently explain grave renewal. I tell people that most people believe that when they buy a plot, that they're buying a piece of real estate for eternity. They conflate perpetual care of the grounds with the idea of forever occupancy. But perpetuity in this instance means for an undetermined period of time. Once the cemetery is full and the funds to maintain it have run out, there's no more perpetuity. And if a highway needs to be run through it, then good luck. So, I'm going to further explain about the purchasers, the right to burial, and the cemetery's ownership of the soil, and then go on to say, once the body is soil, again, green burial's mission, that's our ultimate achievement in green burial. The grave can be reused over deep time. And then you can bring in the concept of conservation easements, actually protecting that land. That's how we get true sustainability. So it's a logical sort of bouncing the ball through this. So here's another graphic. If you don't want to use the other one, use this to explain that same principles. Come up with your own text that explains this as simply as you can, and just get people to follow the logic. They just follow the bouncing balls. And as always, I have another version. This is highly simplified to show the same content, again, for an audience that has this level of interest or the capacity to take it in. So one last concept that we need to be drilling down into and sharing widely. I often hear cremation advocates say that they're making that choice so that they can save land. Well, anyone who's had any experience with land trusts or conservation knows how flawed that rationale is. We save land by buying it and stewarding it and managing it, not by ignoring it and hoping somebody else will deal with it. So natural burial, and specifically conservation burial, takes the issue of land protection by the horns, while cremation skirts the issue of land protection along with sustainability, modeling, climate resiliency, and a whole slew of other related concerns. I mean, that's sort of the cremation side of it. You can come up with an even better argument by following the points on this slide and build up the case for conservation burial. And I've also played around a lot with building graphics that can begin to broach those direct and indirect benefits. And these are important. We use these at the Conservation Burial Alliance. Here's one that takes some studying again, but it seems to have the right balance of information and appeal. Again, more for a website or a handout. Here's another one This one's similar information, but it's a call to action for anybody who it takes the time to read it. And again, walks people through the experience. So see which one you feel says what you want to convey, and then pare it down. See what parts lend themselves to informing people of the message you're bringing. And a couple more things. From time to time, I'm asked to lay out the money. All the money guys want to know the bottom lines. And of course, those lines vary wildly. I mean, the difference between a burial in a town just north of me that charges $10 for a burial, as opposed to Greenwood in Brooklyn, big differences here. No two cemeteries are going to be alike, but it might be useful for you to dabble around in the numbers so that when you're approached by a would-be donor or someone who's interested in learning more, you'll at least have something to start with. Research what the going rate is for burial plots in your region, and you're going to have a good place to start. For this one in Vermont, I took Billy Campbell's carrying capacity estimates to calculate the number of people who could be buried per acre, and then added a couple of plot price points to help estimate those earnings quickly. Then I added the carbon sequestration per burial. And at that point, we've enhanced the carbon picture, added it to the money, and that's what conservation donors understand. So just to go a little bolder, color may be more or less persuasive. You decide, that kind of thing. And finally, just when I'd lulled you into believing that we were all done with statistics, here we go again, but for a very different reason. The question reporters ask me, and probably ask you all the time, is how many natural burials are happening every year in the United States? Well, my answer is always the same. No government agency keeps track of what goes into the grave other than the name of the person and what they died of. Burial is burial statistically, with a $40,000 gold Prometheus casket or a cotton bedsheet shroud, and it doesn't matter. The only statistics we have long-term that are indicators of interest come from the list that I've been keeping since 2014 that tells us roughly how many green cemeteries are available. And the reason this is compelling is that it demonstrates supply and demand. There wouldn't be an increasing supply if there wasn't growing demand. And that is pretty much the best we can offer for that question. But one more way to look at the green burial picture is in pie chart form. This gives us a good sense of the ratio of cemetery levels to one another and helps us as advocates. We can think about where our advocacy capital needs to be spent. And here's the last way to look at the same data that I have. Billy and I find trends in green burial cemetery growth encouraging, despite the media focus elsewhere and what seems to be slow growth. But what we're seeing is steady growth, not this flash in the pan that we suspect some other boutique death services of all kinds are probably going to do. We don't know, but we'd love it if we all had a sexier reputation, but we'll take this track record any day. And by the way, I mean green burial sexier. Billy and I are sexy enough already. I can't wait to tell him that one. Polls can tell you what people think at any given moment. They can also sort of explain what people's hope is for the future. But again, I caution people to be careful who you quote, know what the statistics actually explain. I use this from American Funeral Director. This is Kate Boylston. It's a funeral trade magazine. They've been doing this study off and on for a very long time. And the most recent study that they did here in 2021 was miles ahead of what they had found even 5 years earlier. If you look at the NFDA's numbers on who wants this, they're somewhere in the 60% range. I think that's too vast a distinction. So I question what the pool was that they were using. But I like these stats because I can explain that 91% of people are more interested in environmentally friendly, outcomes. But the second question I always explain is, if you had to choose within the next 2 weeks, what would you choose? And that gives us a really, that's much more vital a number. And I always trying to get them to go and take a look to try to find a green cemetery near them. I give them the way to get there. So wrapping up, as much as I love good marketing, it's not where you find your information if you want to be viewed as credible. When Billy and I write anything to do with any of this topic, we first look at peer-reviewed research, professional journals, other vetted entities that have a system for weeding out biased information and have vigorous fact-checking from verifiable sources. Whether you're reading the New York Times or your local paper or some business's websites or their newsletter, remember where they often get their information. So be careful. I also want to let you know, it's a little tidbit here, that after years of trying to get a green burial specific study going, like a field study that physically measures soil changes and existing green burial graves, we might have something brewing. I can't tell you more than that, but just that there is some hope on the horizon here. But being able to quote that data that talks about water and soil health from a bona fide study is going to be just a huge game changer for the green burial movement. So stay tuned for that. Might be a while because these things are slow, but it's in the works. If you want to start generating content yourself, just dig into some primary sources. Here are the ones that I have been able to trust over time. The picture of federal government offices now is changing. So just be careful what you're looking at, but for the most part, it's a good place to start. And you may have been wondering about creating graphics, infographics. Excel, of course, you can do your pie charts and your graphs, but here are a few products that I recommend taking a look at. You'll finally find gazillions more in an online search. The ones I use the most of this group are Infography and Venngage. They work pretty well. And finally, if you're going to publish photographs, again, please, please, please attribute them accurately. And don't take any from this slide because I can't fit all the owners in here. This is just a visual for you. You can scour social media and websites for images, but please pay attention to the photographer if it's available, if the name is available, and you want the place where it was taken. Just today on social media, I had to go in where a photograph, a well-known photograph by Danelle Dries of Heritage Acres was once again falsely attributed to someone else. Every time I see them, I get in there and I try to make a difference. This matters. This is people's intellectual property. And they're giving it to us, green burial advocates, for free to be able to keep the mission going. So I just want you also to beware of using images from news agencies without written permission. One unauthorized use of a picture from the New York Times or Reuters or the AP could cost you thousands of dollars. I actually know people who've had it happen. So please be careful. I have two systems that I use, by the way, for sort of managing all of these images. I'm always foraging for them. I'm always looking for them. I want them because I want to keep trying to tell the best picture I can, the best story that I can. So the first one is a huge PowerPoint slide deck that I have. I keep, I don't know, I think I'm up now in the 900s or something like that. But I make a note on them about who took the picture, where it was from, plus the date if possible. And then I'm going to add any other distinguishing details. I can put those in the notes. And this makes the images searchable by the cemetery, by content type. It's just really a great system for me to use myself. The other thing I do is put together a folder and then create subfolders with labels like family at the gravesite or woven caskets or something like that. And this keeps me, it keeps everything organized in a way where I can, sorry, my dog. It helps me to put the type of image together and have them in close proximity, because then I can take a look at them together and decide which one tells the best story at that moment. And it also means that every image is titled with the necessary attributions, plus I use a coded number. And if you put it online, then it needs to have that identifying information embedded in the title, right? Because other people are going to download it and there it's going to be. So the slides that I showed you and lots more, plus links to the documents that I mentioned and a PDF of this presentation. This is all going to be available on the download page of the New Hampshire Funeral website. This link right here. And this is the only thing that you need to write down. We're also going to add this when Maura sends out a follow-up. She's going to include that. So you'll be able to find it there as well. Okay. And finally, don't forget to end your presentation with ways for people to contact you. It's also a good place to explain in writing why they should have been believing you all along. So, so that's the way I like to look at things. Make sure it's there. So there we go. How did we do for time? I think we did a little more than I anticipated, but
We
if you're okay
about,
with,
about 4 minutes left.
Okay, sorry. Just hoping to have more time.
We can do what we can, and whatever we don't get to, I can also include in that follow-up email if there's any pressing questions that we don't get the chance to answer.
Wonderful. Great. We'll do that.
So one that we had that came in at the very beginning, which you did address a little bit, but I'll give you the chance to expand on it. Aspen asked, how are we losing the green burial media battle? Are there some examples we can hear about?
Yeah, we're losing it because we're going up against these cremation processes, and there are businesses that are being opened, and they're generating money. They're bringing in their businesses, so they're following the general business model. We're nonprofit. The green burial movement in general is nonprofit based, so we don't have deep pockets for big marketing campaigns. We're also, I don't know why, again, I don't know why we're not sexy enough to get that attention. For the most part, when I'm speaking to people out in the community, they get it right away and they're thrilled. But I don't know exactly why we're losing it, but I can tell you that I would say 9 out of 10 articles that I read that say that they're about natural burial are really talking about something else.
The next question that we had, part of this has been answered. HK Lee asked, are there upstart costs or environmental impact data for alkaline hydrolysis? Melissa hopped in and said that the machines are around $250K, but are you aware of any environmental impact data beyond what you shared?
Yeah, we do have plenty. I'm just trying to give you an overview, but yes, there's plenty of information. And I would suggest that you contact me and we can get into what it is you're looking for specifically, because it's a lot. Yeah.
Are you okay with me sharing your email in that follow-up email then for follow-up questions?
Absolutely. Sure.
Thank you so much, Lee. And then we had another question. Are you actively doing any work to encourage traditional or conventional cemeteries to add a green section or become a hybrid cemetery?
Yeah, absolutely. My preference is for conservation and natural burials, obviously, but I also recognize the need of regular people for a sense of place. It's really important to people to be buried in a place where the people associate them with. So I frequently am out in communities working with conservation or cemetery trustees. Here where I live, it's all municipality system anyway, unless you form a nonprofit. So I'm out there talking to, over 250 towns with cemeteries who want to know how to do this. And I'm happy to explain it to them. I've also I do this with people all around the country. In fact, if I get a call from, Michigan, I'm happy to either connect them to someone there that I know, and that's really helpful. All of you, you might get a call. And if not, then I'll do the research and I'll help them. It's important.
Absolutely. So we are at 5, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you so much, Lee. I know I speak for everyone here when I say we're so grateful for these new tools to discuss green burial with our communities, and I can't wait to share them with all of you in that follow-up email. So if you do have any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, feel free to respond to the email we sent out today or to ask Lee directly when we send her email to you on Friday.
Great. Do we have the chat captured, by the way, Maura?
We do, yes.
Okay, wonderful. I'll be happy to go through those and answer all of those and send that out too.
Absolutely. So I'll go ahead, I'll leave this on for a couple minutes then. So if anybody does have questions that they'd like us to follow up with, you can drop them in the chat right now. And I'll go ahead and leave it open, but we will leave it here for now. Thank you so much, Lee, for this wonderful presentation. And thank you to all of you for being here for the Green Burial Council's public webinar.
Thank you. Okay, you need to be quiet.